Good morning. The open meeting of the Federal Election Commission for Thursday, February 11, 2016 is now in order. Thank you for your patience. There have been some late negotiations and discussions and some drafts that are currently being printed and will shortly be distributed and discussed. So we figured let's get underway, and we should have those momentarily. First motion is on late submitted documents, of which there are several. Mr. Vice Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I move to suspend the rules on the timely submission of agenda documents in order to consider the late submission of the following documents. Agenda document number 16-07-A, which is draft A of the NSAO. Agenda document number 16-08-B, which is draft B of the NSAO. Agenda document number 15-69D, which is draft D of Hillary for America AO. Agenda document number 1569E, which is draft D of the Hillary for America AO.
Is there any discussion on the motion? If not,
Pardon
all those
me?
in. Oh, yes.
Excuse me, I think it is 1607B,
1607E.
1607A, and 1607B.
And I have that. What did I say?
I believe you said 1608B.
Okay, pardon me. Yeah, the first document would be 1607A, and the second document would be 1607B. Sorry about that.
All right. Thank you for that. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed?
Aye.
Oh. The motion passes by a vote of 6-0. Next, we have the correction and approval of minutes. Mr. Vice Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the Commission approve the minutes of the open meeting of December 17, 2015, as set forth in Agenda Document 16-04-A. I further move that the Commission approve the minutes of the open meeting of January 14, 2016, as set forth in Agenda Document 16-06-A.
For that motion, is there any discussion? If none, all those in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 Aye. Madam Secretary, the motion passes by a vote of 6-0. The draft that we are waiting on relates to the second item on our agenda today, the Draft Advisory Opinion 2015-14, Hillary for America. And so I would recommend that we switch up the order here and that we consider Draft Advisory Opinion 2015-16, Niger Innes for Congress, first. And then as we get the drafts, we can then come back to the Hillary for America advisory opinion. I apologize for fouling up your plans, but stick around and we will get to that advisory opinion soon. So, without objection, we will turn to Niger Innes for Congress. And Mr. Backer is here on behalf of the requester, and please take a seat at the table. We have Ms. Selenkoff and Mr. Knopf from the Office of General Counsel ably handling this advisory opinion. Ms. Selenkoff. Good morning.
Chair Peterson, and good morning, Commissioners. Agenda documents 1607A and B present two draft advisory opinions in response to a request by Innes for Congress. Mr. Innes was a candidate in 2014. He lost the primary election, and his committee now asks two questions about contributions for the general election, in which Mr. Innes did not participate, that it received prior to the primary election loss. First, the committee asks whether it may pay legal, accounting, compliance, and transaction costs that it traces to the general election contributions from those contributions. Both drafts conclude that it may not. Second, the committee asks whether it may donate to charity those general election contributions it has been unable to refund. Draft A concludes the committee may not, and Draft B concludes the committee may donate those amounts to charity. The Commission received one comment from the requester, and I'm available to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Selenkoff. Is there any discussion or questions for requester? Mr. Vice Chairman.
Mr. Backer, do you have any, are you still pursuing the issue of whether or not those costs can be recovered?
The question of part, excuse me, the part that's covered under question one?
Yeah.
Yes, we are.
Okay. Well, let me ask you some questions. And you say these are unique costs, but the list that I see is they consist of transaction-specific costs. Are we talking about 4 people?
Yes,
Okay, and so these unique costs are devoted only to expenses incurred with respect to those 4 people?
yes, because all the other ones have been refunded. But as a general precept, it sort of would have broader application.
What?
I would suggest that if, that there's broader application here, that if it works for these 4 people in this situation, it should probably work in general for anybody else.
Right,
But we're only asking about for these
I'm
4
kind of getting that this
transactions.
is a precursor to a future policy whereby all of these expenses can be picked up and there wouldn't be a full refund.
I would suggest so, but we're only asking about these 4 specific transaction costs.
But let's talk about this. What we're basically asking is for the people who are entitled to full refund to pay these costs, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so the check processing fees in this case was how much for the 4?
I don't know the answer to the specific per transaction costs on each of these individually.
How about the transfer fees?
Approximately, and I'd have to go back and look, but it's between 3.5% and 4.5% depending on what kind of credit card the actual transaction was processed on.
Okay, so what happened in this case?
So there's credit card transactions that are made, or the check transactions are a separate question, but there's credit card transactions that are made, and each individual transaction has a per transaction processing cost charged by the credit card vendor. And so there's a percentage of fees plus, and it varies slightly based on whether it's a Visa, MasterCard, or an Amex or a Discover. And so each individual transaction made by credit card has a unique transaction processing cost that we would argue should not be refunded because it's already been spent. And then separately, that's sort of the major component of it. And the second part was fundraisers who are compensated for the solicitation of these general election fees or paid for the successful solicitation. That percentage should be deducted as well. And in that case, it's I'd have to double check, but I'm pretty sure this was the fundraiser was making either 10 or 15%, and I think it's 10% for this fundraiser.
So, and then we'll go back to, is there a bounce check fee here?
Not on these transactions that I'm aware of, but we kind of wanted to be inclusive of it, just in case we missed some transactional items.
Okay, but you're only talking about 4 people. Were there any
Right.
bounce
On these
checks?
4, we're not there aren't any bounce checks.
So what would be the purpose of asking for it with this AO?
We wanted to be inclusive of the kind of transactions that we think ought to be permissible, even if it's not specifically permissible to these 4. If it happens, we wanted to have that as sort of part of the
But we
answer.
don't have a true legal issue here.
With respect to the
Bounce
bounce check fees, probably not. But again, I think as you noted, there's broader implications to the outcome on this question.
Then, yes. And the fundraising commissions in connection with these matters, where each of the 4 contributors had a deduction to the commission or to the campaign because there was a commission paid?
Yes, so there was a payment made to the fundraiser on the solicitation of the successful solicitation of these fees. Those funds came out of the primary contribution, or the amount of the primary contribution as opposed to the specific general election funds.
And how much was those, do you know?
10%. I'm almost certain it's 10%. There was at one point a separate piece that was 15%, but I think these are within the 10% bucket.
And were the 4 contributors contributing equal amounts?
No, there's I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but there were 4 different contributions. I think one was 2,600, one was 1,000 or 2,000, one was 1,400. It was different amounts.
Then why do you say these are unique? Does it make a difference in the analysis?
Yes, I think when you have when I say unique, I mean in terms, it's unique to that specific individual contribution. So it's not, for example, so we know for a fact that this $1,000 contribution has a credit card processing cost of $15.32 because we can look at a specific credit card bill and find that transaction. We know it has that individual contribution of $1,000 related to or caused a $100 transaction processing fee, or sorry, a fundraising fee. And so it's unique to that individual transaction. I can imagine that there are plenty of fees that might be assessed to a campaign that are not specific to a contribution. So for example, if a fundraiser gets a bonus for raising $100,000, even if it includes general election funds, that bonus wouldn't be tied to a specific general election contribution. It's to a general course of performance. And I think there's a lot of activity that might fall within that non-specific, non-unique category, but there are transactions that occur purely because it's a general election contribution and it's specific to one particular general election contribution only.
And that applied in these 4 cases?
Yes,
Okay. Did any of these donors give any money to the primary?
yes, all of them
Each
did.
of them did. Now, the transfer fees, tell me about what happened with respect to these 4 donors.
And I'm not sure what you mean, what transfer fees we're talking about. So I think there might have been I may be thinking about different.
I mean, you're talking about them in the sense that you confirm that those are items confirming a telephone conversation you had with our office. Not our office, the Walther office, but the down in RAD, I assume, or some, I'm not sure, OGC.
I'm not entirely sure which fees we're referring to when we say the transfer fees, but generally it's the cost of the solicitation of the successful solicitation of the contribution. There's the cost of the processing of the contribution by a credit card. To the extent that there would be a transfer fee, a cost of transition, taking that amount of money that's going in and moving it from one account to another, that might be a transfer fee. I'm not entirely sure, looking back, what specific piece of it we're discussing. But again, we're mainly interested in, or we're only interested in the fees that are specific to the individual contributions that are traceable to to these individual contributions. So there might be, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Maybe we had a FedEx a check, that would be a transfer fee, I would imagine. So if we had a FedEx one specific check and we're paying for that, arguably that might be a fee. If we're FedExing 2 checks, it wouldn't be uniquely traceable to that one contribution. But again, I'm not entirely sure what specifically we talked about transfer fees.
Okay, so this is unclear. Check processing fees?
Right.
Either a check or a credit card. Which ones are we talking about here?
Credit card processing fees, to the extent there might have been ACH processing fees, which are the drafting of when money automatically goes from one bank account to another. Those are separate kinds of process. They're essentially the same nature as a credit card processing fee, but they're just ACH fees as opposed to credit card fees.
So were there check processing fees with respect to these 4?
I don't believe so. I believe these are all credit card processing.
So would that be you say account maintenance fees, check processing fees, transfer fees, bounce check fees, and fundraising commissions? So which ones apply to this case?
To these specific 4 transactions, credit card processing fees, fundraising commissions.
That is not listed.
The credit card processing fees?
Yeah.
I think that would be probably the processing fees writ large, because processing fees would relate to both credit cards or ACH transactions.
Okay. All right, so which ones are we actually talking about then?
The credit card processing fees, which are part of the processing fee category, the fundraising fees that are related to each individual contribution being raised. I don't believe in this specific case there were any bounce check related fees. I'd have to double check, but I don't think that was the case. I know that client had checks that bounce and caused a fee. And of course, legal, accounting, and compliance costs generally. Bank maintenance fees, that relates to the existence of the bank account solely. That the fact that the account exists, there's a fee that was assessed for that.
For a checking account?
Yeah, just for the existence of this checking account. It's we're talking a very modest amount of money, but it's only existing for I mean, in the sense of like it's a couple of dollars.
But those aren't unique, are they?
They're not uniquely traceable to these transactions, but they are uniquely traceable only to the existence of the general election account. And so again, while we think there are specific transactions here, but there's potentially broader implications, and we wanted to be inclusive rather than over-inclusive rather than under-inclusive.
Well, when you go to write a check, how are you going to make a deduction to these 4 people?
I'm sorry, what?
I gather the exact amount of $8,000 that these people are entitled to a refund, less whatever we say can be deducted. Is that correct?
Yes. The goal is to anything that could be deducted would then be in effect transferred from the general to the primary account where those funds were originally paid out of, and then the balance would, pursuant to our request under question 2, would be then donated to a charity.
I may come back to that, but let me ask you this in connection with the efforts to obtain a refund.
I'm sorry, with
what efforts were made to obtain a refund?
To make the refunds? First, we issued a check to the contributors. Those checks were not cash or deposited, and then we made phone calls. Either the compliance team or the campaign team called the individual donors, and then there was a second issuing of the checks. The donors are not responsive, and to be honest, I'm not entirely sure why. If somebody sent me a couple $1,000 check, I'd be pretty quick to deposit it. But for whatever reason, these amounts have been mailed out to them twice. They've not responded to them. They've not bounced back to us through the USPS system. So somebody's getting this mail and just not processing it on the individual donor side. To be honest, it was a very surprising thing. I really didn't expect this to happen. I have another client that this occurred with, and in talking to my peers in the service side of the industry, this apparently happens every now and again. Any committee that raises any amount of money seems to have donors, and where they have to make refunds for the general, they have donors that just don't deposit refund checks.
Well, you've got their address, right?
Yeah, and we've sent checks to them by mail.
The same address that they used for when they made their first contribution,
Yes, I would.
primary, and those checks went through.
The information, well, it would have been mailed to the address that we had that they would have given us when they're completing the donor information for us to perform our best efforts compliance. So that would have been the address that we would have mailed it to. And I'm pretty sure on all of these, we actually asked for, has there been any change in the address? Are you aware of anything to the local people in Nevada? No one was aware of any change of address. I find it really weird, to be honest with you, that they're getting checks and they're not depositing it. On the other hand, people who cut $2,700 or $2,600 checks probably have a different set of concerns than I do. So,
But if you go spend the money for returning it to charity or to the government and they go to cash the check, they won't have any money to.
well, we will of course cancel the checks. The checks are now stale dated anyway. They're more than 90 days old, and so we haven't canceled them to date, but we probably would before we donated the balance of the charity.
So they'd lose their opportunity for a refund.
Yes, to the extent that they've sat on that opportunity for almost 2 years now. In fairness, about 1.5 years, I think the primary was in May of 14, so it's slightly less than 2 years.
Well, then, if you got $8,000 and there's only 4 people, couldn't somebody pick up the phone? I mean, you're the treasurer, am I correct?
Yes,
I mean, it's not, we didn't know, I didn't realize that when I read your AO. I just learned that this morning. But you're the treasurer.
yes,
So you're in charge of all this money?
yes.
Okay.
And
So-
phone calls have been made to each of these donors unsuccessfully.
By you?
No, by the campaign staff, by the candidate himself, by the fundraiser that was involved. They weren't able to get a hold of anybody.
Nobody picked up the phone on all those 4 of them?
Apparently not. And again, the voicemails, I'm told voicemails were left. It's weird. I don't really understand why people aren't taking these checks that we're sending to them. And by all indication, the addresses are correct. Short of showing up on their doorsteps with a bundle of cash, we're not really sure what we could do. And I'm pretty sure that would violate a separate reg about petty cash.
So what possible legal theory do you have that these people there should be a deduction from whatever they're entitled to in the way of a refund? Because I assume what you do is send them a check for the full amount?
I'm sorry, what?
Did you send them a check for the full amount?
If they were going to cash it?
2 checks already to each of them.
Yeah, we would, setting aside the request, we sent them checks for the full amount. If were you to agree with our legal theory on this, then we would, I guess we would again send them a check for the discounted amount. Though again, if you also agree with our request in part 2 of this, we would deduct the fee amount and then just donate the rest to the charity. But so I guess it depends whether you agree with section 2 or not. But if you agree with 1 and not 2, we would issue a new check for the difference between the amount that they contributed and the fees that were paid for that contribution. And then if you agree with part 2, we're going to skip that step because they clearly don't care and they've twice ignored us.
So in the future, do you give a full refund unless they don't catch it? And then if they ask for it, you'll give a partial refund? Or in the future, will you be deducting anytime there's a refund, no matter how much, $100,000, $200,000 to 50 or 100 people or more? There'll be a unique cost deduction all the way through before they get the full refund. Is that what you're going to do?
Yes, I would say that under the theory under part 1, the processing cost of contributions, frankly, a committee would have that choice. They could choose to just make a full refund. And I can see a lot of situations where the candidates are going to do that anyway, because it's a good business practice in the sense of if you're running for office, you're soliciting contributions, you want to keep your donors happy, and you might run again. So I think a lot of people will still choose to fully refund to the extent they're able to. I also think, however, that campaigns are going to be well advised to deduct the amount of the processing fees that they're they're being assessed for these general election contributions and spend those funds on the general election, on those costs, or at a minimum, put them aside somewhere to make that determination later. But I would suggest that the processing fees and the fundraising costs should be paid out, and that at the committee's discretion, they should be able to make a refund of the rest of the contribution less those uniquely traceable costs.
Okay, so we're really talking about a whole new process for everybody.
I don't know how new it necessarily is. I think from an accounting perspective, it's a pretty straightforward project or process from the Treasury side. You know, you have contribution and it's going to the general. You know how much the credit card cost of that is, because we get the bank statements, and you know what you're paying the fundraisers. So realistically, we have all our clients will have two accounts. They'll have a primary and a general. And you would cut the fundraising commission out of the general account for the fundraiser. The credit card processing is a little more complicated because you only get one merchant account. It all has to go into one bank account. But you could fairly easily look at how much was charged on each individual transaction and then move those funds from the general to the primary account. So I don't think it creates a lot of burden at all. To the extent that the commission felt that those individual transactions needed to be reported, it's very easy to report as well. Particularly for online contributions, where most commercial vendors that I've seen candidates and political committees use track the cost of each individual contribution's fees. So I know, the 4.5%, or if it's a fixed fee, or if it's using a merchant platform, the 3% plus whatever Visa or MasterCard is charging, I can fairly easily export a file and see that data. So there's not a lot of difficulty in terms of the accounting side on the committee.
Some people pay by credit card, some people pay by check. Some people pay through some other means. Are we really talking about the so-called unique situation, or just in general?
I think
At that point, you might be talking about
to the extent we're talking about
thousands of checks.
to the extent we're talking about individual processing costs, I think it has to be related to the specific individual transaction. So, for example, we encourage our clients who have a lot of volume to use a caging firm, and there's a lot of firms that do this, and they physically open envelopes and process checks and run credit cards, and they actually bill two ways. They bill flat fees, or they bill per transaction fees, or they can bill hourly. If it's an hourly fee, I don't see how it's reasonably traceable to an individual transaction. If it's a flat fee, I don't see how it's reasonably traceable to an individual transaction. But to the extent that they're saying, hey, these are your primary contribution checks, these are your general election contribution checks, and we charge you 17 cents per check. I'm making this number up, by the way. 17 cents per check deposited. We know exactly how much each one of those checks cost in terms of processing fees. And I think that piece of it should be able to be deducted from any potential refund. And again, setting aside the legal accounting and compliance cost argument of question one, these uniquely traceable costs, I think, are something that really properly ought to be paid out of those funds. And there's a fun legal argument as to why, actually.
Let's have it.
So, in fact, there's two. The first is it's pretty clear that if a candidate receives a contribution for $2,700 by credit card, the credit card processing cost has to come out of that $2,700. They can't get a $2,700 contribution and a $100 fee on top. So the value of a contribution is the sum of the contribution itself and the processing costs involved in it. And I'm sure everyone on the receiving side would love to be able to charge the amounts on top, but the law is fairly clear in this, and there's, with the exception that it's miscited in the index of the CFR, and so we can't find the exact statutory site or the regulatory site, but it's pretty clear that any credit card processing on my contributions coming in comes out of the amount that I'm receiving. And so the problem that you then have is I'm getting I'm going to use rounder numbers just for ease here. 2,500 in the primary, 2,500 in the general is coming at the same time. I'm paying a 5% credit card processing fee on this. It happens to be a flat transaction fee. So this bucket of money here, I have $2,500. The cost of processing that is $125, but I'm not paying it out of here. I'm paying it out of the primary election account. And so the value of this contribution is actually $2,500 plus the $125 at the time that it's made. Now, the fact that it's not necessary, I may not actually get to spend this money, I may not be able to use this money, doesn't change the fact that there's a processing cost involved in it. And so this bucket of money is more than the value that is permissible for the contribution if I'm forced to pay the contribution fees out of this bucket of money. And then there's a slightly more philosophical approach is these are the buckets of allocable speech that I'm allowed to engage in this matter. You know, I'm allowed to have $2,500 of speech related to your general election, $2,500 of speech worth here. I'm reducing the amount of speech that I get in this bucket, which I think matters a little bit more before the primary, in order to subsidize this other bucket of speech. And so I think what ends up happening is, and again, this is a little philosophical, but you're taking permissible amounts of speech that you're allowed to have in the primary, and you're losing that speech. You're not able to engage in that $125 worth of associational speech. And so I think that is part of a philosophical problem with preventing the fees related to the contribution from coming out of the contribution themselves.
Well, I think that's not the one for today, but it seems to me that if you wanted to get that particular, you could direct people to give you money in a certain way where there wouldn't be those fees. Or you could find a variety of ways to acquire money without having to pay a professional. But if you're going to do that, then somebody says they're entitled to make a contribution. Part of the expense of the campaign is just what happens in the campaign. You know, let me ask you this. On your reports at this point, it only shows that there's $57 in the account.
In the primary account, yes.
Okay. Is there any account that shows there's $8,000 there
There's a,
that's reported to the FEC?
that should be on the reports. There's a primary account and there's a general election account. The primary account has $57.16, and the general election account has approximately $8,000 in it. And so it should be on the report as received. You know, it actually might not be, because when we cut the checks originally, we would have recorded that disbursement, and we haven't canceled those stale dated checks. So I guess in that sense, those checks are not going to show up on the report because we haven't canceled them yet, hoping, you know, some way they'll actually do something with them. So once we cancel those checks, we would then have to reapply those funds back into the FEC report.
Okay, so these have been out though for how long, these 4 checks?
The second round of checks, certainly over a year. They would have been issued prior to the end of 2014.
Okay, so anytime that there's check out for no matter how long, a certain length of time, it's never shown as it coming through, or how does it work?
On the FEC report or on the bank report?
This like this, you know, so if the check comes through, then that's when you show it?
Well, when we cut the check, the refund check, we're reporting it as the date that we're issuing the refund, and so that comes off the cash balance in the report. When we cancel the check, then we're essentially applying we're removing that transaction, and so it adds money back into the cash on hand balance. And so the fact that you know, so technically it's not there, but we also have cash sitting in the bank account as a practical matter, and obviously we have to continue having reporting obligations until this gets resolved.
That's all I have right now.
Commissioner Goodman.
Yes, Mr. Backer. So you have $57 in your primary account, and you have $8,000 in your general account, general election account.
So that actually no, there's a completely unrelated problem where there's a little bit less than $8,000 in that account.
Okay.
But yeah, essentially there's $8,000 that should be in the general, and there's $5,700 that are 57.16 cents in the primary.
And but for this issue, this committee wants to terminate.
Oh, yes. There's another outstanding debt that we're negotiating with the debtor, and the debtor, of course, keeps pointing out, but, you know, what about all this money that you have? Because they're aware of this particular situation.
You mean the creditor?
Yeah, sorry, the creditor's aware that the committee exists, that it's aware of this situation because it's a friendly creditor, but they still want to get paid. And so we're negotiating the resolution of that. So I don't know, if we resolve this, it gets us that much closer to getting the committee terminated.
But since you can't resolve this, you're stuck in limbo, I take it.
Yes,
And the committee stays open and has to continue filing reports with the FEC.
yes,
Has to continue incurring services to do so.
yes.
Monthly bank fees to do so, right?
Not anymore. It
Not
did,
anymore?
but it doesn't. It no longer has monthly bank fees.
But
We
there
have
is an overhead to having to
yes.
file reports. And
It's getting a lot of free legal service out of
I
it.
was going to say, who's paying for your fees to be here today on how to resolve this $8,000 problem?
Nobody. We just want to get
You're
this
providing
resolved. So,
in-kind service to this political committee.
yes,
Yeah, essentially, right? Okay.
as do a lot of my
And
peers,
it's
as it
all
turns out.
necessitated by FEC regulatory requirements, right?
I would say yes.
So the law said that your committee could raise these general election funds prior to the primary.
Yes.
You have probably had a First Amendment right to do it too,
Yes.
probably, right?
I would say so.
Money is speech. I can't prevent you from talking about and supporting a future general election candidacy. So, but the law said you could raise it.
Mhm.
And now the law says, but you can't spend any of it. You got to refund it because you lost. And yet you're left with all these administrative costs to deal with the money that the law said that you could raise.
Yes. And that exists
Fairly
only because we
irrational.
raised that law.
It's a fairly irrational regulatory result, isn't it?
It is, and interestingly, it creates an odd tension in the law, because for the law to be internally consistent, if contributions include the value of the processing cost, but we're not allowed to, you're getting this resulting contribution, additional value onto the general election contribution. You're in essence, it's not internally consistent for the law to say that, and then also prevent us from deducting those fees. And so it actually, for the law to be internally consistent, we have to deduct it. I noticed in draft B, on the various places on part one, or the answer to part one where it talks about it, there's actually I don't think there's a clear prohibition on the ability to spend these funds in this way for this particular purpose. I think the purpose of the law is to prevent people from using general election funds to go out and spend money on primary activity. But there's no part of the primary activity that is the transaction processing fee on general election funds. I mean, I think it would be a little bizarre, but nothing technically stops a candidate from raising money just for the general election, even if they have a primary, and raising no primary funds whatsoever.
Right. Yeah, this is a regulatory catch-22 that we have debated in other contexts. I'll just alert you that I'm in a minority opinion about this, and that's why you are not seeing a yes to your question number one. But I believe this regulatory quagmire is a problem, and I've exhorted my colleagues to address it a different way in the past, and I've been unsuccessful. But that's why you're not seeing a yes draft right now on that.
Are there any further questions or discussion? Vice Chairman Walther.
Just a couple follow-ups. Is this money going to the debtor or to charity?
To the charity.
Okay, what about the
Actually,
debtor?
I'm sorry, any processing fees that we're allowed to separate out, that's going to end up going to the debtor. But that's a relatively, while it's important, it's a relatively small amount of money. I think we're looking at, because we've already paid the fundraising fee, we've already paid the credit card processing fee, it's about 15%. So we're looking at, I used to be better at math, about $1,200 that I think would be separated out, and that would go towards the debtor, because we have to pay the debtor and then terminate the thing. And then the balance of the debt would be, we're negotiating how to resolve that. But any funds that are the processing fees, those are going straight to the debtor, and the rest of the non-refundable general election contributions are going to some charity.
One other question. I'm sorry.
Commissioner Goodman.
If you were informed that you could terminate this committee today, okay, would you still want your advisory opinion answered on what you could do with the money with a shut down and terminated committee?
I would want it just because I think it's important to know whether you are or not complying with the law. We have 3-year record-keeping requirements even after the committee terminates. We want to be able to document our compliance with the law in case down the road there's an audit. So I think it's important to have an advisory opinion, even if we are able to terminate, though I would very happily I'd be thrilled to terminate.
I would encourage you to call Debbie Chacona and talk about your termination options, okay?
Any further discussion or questions? At this point, I know that Commissioner Walther, I know that he has several questions that he obviously asked, and there had been some question as to whether or not we might want to vote today, or whether or not there would be rather a preference to vote either at a future meeting or even on tally, depending, because I believe that the 60-day deadline runs on Tuesday, next Tuesday.
The 16th after the
Tuesday
holiday.
the 16th. And so I just want to get my colleagues' preference.
I have no problem with holding it over and voting by tally or whichever way is appropriate.
Vice Chairman, what would your preference be?
That's
Okay. I think that the information that you've provided, I think some of my colleagues would like to chew on that. And the question I would ask of you, Mr. Backer, is would we need to get an extension if we were to go beyond Tuesday and consider this and vote in a live meeting like this? We would need to get an extension And so I guess first ask if you would be willing to grant that extension until the next meeting, or whether if you wouldn't, we could resolve it by tally before Tuesday. But I wanted, that is within.
My client would be happy to agree to an extension. Certainly, ironically enough, yesterday we filed a notice of a petition for rulemaking about creating time for public comments on draft advisory opinions. And so you have two opinions now. Others might want to comment as well. And if there's any additional information we could provide to help people out based on these questions, I think an extension would be fine.
Okay. So we'll then hold this matter over for discussion at the next meeting, which will be on the 25th. And so agreeable to hold it until the 25th then, Mr. Backer, or do you need to first inquire with your client, or can we?
We can go ahead, but the client has, I mentioned that this would be a possibility, so client's fine with extension.
Okay, thank you very much.
In the hopes of quickly terminating, so.
All righty. Vice Chairman Walter.
Yes, I don't mean to be, the only reason I brought it up is because it was brought up in another context, but in connection with your compensation, have you been compensated at all?
I was paid for by the committee back in, when the committee had funds in the primary account, but I've not been compensated for a particularly long time on the matter, and we're not expecting to be compensated from this.
I understand, thanks.
Unless, of course, the commission agrees with legal, accounting, and compliance costs, which apparently it uniformly does not.
All right. Is there anything further? If not, then we will hold over this discussion until the 25th. Thank you very much, Mr. Backer.
Thank you.
We'll now turn back to agenda item number 2, which is Draft Advisory Opinion 2015-14, Hillary of America. And we have Mr. Burkon and Ms. Lopez on behalf of the requester, and please join us at the table. Yes, Commissioner Weintraub.
I'm guessing that the original motion on late submitted documents didn't include this latest draft because it wasn't in front of us at that point. So I could make the motion if you want, or 15-69.
It did.
It's included?
Yes.
Even though we
Okay.
didn't have it, even though it didn't exist yet?
It
But
existed.
it
Wow.
existed, we just didn't have copies of it.
That's very cool.
Steve
Okay.
is very prescient.
That's
I'm
awesome.
telling you.
Thank you. Good job.
All right. We have Mr. Wright and Mr. Knopp from the Office of General Counsel on this, and there have been some developments since we last discussed this. So, Mr. Wright, why don't you update us on the status of this request?
Thank you, Chairman Peterson, and good morning, Commissioners. Before you is Agenda Document 1569, which contains 5 draft responses to an advisory opinion by Hillary for America. The requester, again, asks whether DePaul University may provide a stipend and academic credit to a student who interned in the requester's compliance and vetting departments. Both drafts A and B had concluded that the provision of a stipend is permissible under the Act and regulations for legal and compliance services, but not for the student's other work for the campaign. And those drafts concluded that the provision of academic credit is permissible for all the student's work. Draft C concluded that the provision of a stipend academic credit is permissible under the Act and Commission regulations for all of the student's work. And now, late-breaking developments, drafts D and E conclude that the provision of the stipend and academic credit is permissible because the stipend is provided for a bona fide educational objective and not for the provision of personal services to the requester. The Commission has received 2 comments on the request and 2 comments on the drafts. Thank you. I'd be happy to address any questions you have.
Thank you for that. So as you can see, there's been very little activity going on with respect to this draft since we last discussed this in this meeting. I guess, first of all, I would just ask if any of my colleagues have questions or have any discussion. Commissioner Hunter.
Thank you, and thank you for your patience on this one. And thanks to my colleagues for their willingness to work with us on this. In particular, Commissioner Goodman has worked hard to get it dropped with 4 votes. I have a couple of questions. One of them is a very quick factual one, and then a couple of legal issues. First, is my understanding correct that if a student at DePaul is in the extended studies program, wait, let me rephrase that. If a student at DePaul could apply for a stipend through the grant program, regardless of whether or not they're getting credit through the extended studies program, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so you don't have to be getting credit to be getting the grant?
You do not.
Okay, thank you. And then the other comment I'd like to make, I don't know if this really changes where we go on draft D or not, but we've talked about the last, what we call boilerplate in the advisory opinions that we've released here, which is, of course, just a reiteration of the statute. And obviously, we give guidance when people come in with a specific question. And so generally speaking, we provide the relevant legal analysis. What's the statement of the law? You know, often we cite the statute, the regs, and sometimes the E&J, and then we apply that law to the facts presented. And then one of the sentences in the boilerplate says, any person involved in a specific transaction or activity which is indistinguishable in all its material aspects from the transaction or activity with respect to which this advisory opinion is rendered may rely on this advisory opinion. The cite to 52 U.S.C. 30108 C1b. And so the issue here is that not so much for DePauw and the student here, because hopefully we'll be able to give an answer today to your specific request, but that sentence has to mean something. And so other people who are reading this have to be able to rely on what our legal analysis is to answer their question. And the threshold issue is, what is a material aspect here? And so I was a little bit more interested, and apparently it wouldn't garner 4 votes, to be a little bit more broad in the legal principle here, to say that as long as there's a bona fide educational purpose, a student would be able to provide services to a campaign because the services weren't for the purpose of helping the campaign. They were instead for educational benefit. In my read of Draft D, it's a little bit more narrow than that. So I'm just kind of thinking through under Draft D, what is a material aspect? And we've answered the question on credit, so that's not material for this conclusion. And the second question is whether or not this program is offered through a university, and whether or not that's a material aspect to Draft E. And I guess that question is more properly directed to my colleague. So that's why is because I'm trying to, I don't know if you want to take a stab at that, that's fine with me. But is there anything, specific about a university that makes that a material aspect of this decision? If you want to take a stab at that one.
Yeah, and first off, thanks to all the commissioners for working very hard on this and for hopefully getting us a yes answer that we can bring back to the student today. I think in our latest round of comments, we tried to set forth a framework that could answer the question and address your concern, Commissioner Hunter, about sort of future guidelines, knowing that obviously the answer is limited to this request. And I think we believe that we sort of picked out 2 kind of important features here. One was the clear bona fide educational purpose that we thought sort of shone through the entire request, and we set forth a couple of criteria that we thought demonstrated that bona fide educational purpose, which part of which was the importance of this to the curriculum, part of which was the sort of status of the university and the tax rules under which it operated, and part of which was really the methodology by which these awards are granted, the rubric that's used, and the objective nature of it, which does not focus on whether or not the ultimate entity for which the student is interning is a political committee or not. But we sort of viewed those as proof points for a standard of bona fide educational purpose. The other point that we thought was particularly material that relates to that, but maybe is slightly different, is the fact that the expenses here, or the amount of the stipend, is actually clearly not tied to any amount of hours worked. It is really not compensation for the services. It is tied to the expenses that the student incurs, and in fact doesn't even reach that amount. And we found that to be persuasive, just as under the statute, which talks about compensation for personal services, that here it is clear that there is no tie between the amount of the stipend and the amount of hours worked, which is more sort of typical for a compensation arrangement.
Thank you.
Commissioner Weintraub.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to particularly thank Mike Colombo on Commissioner Goodman's staff and Tom Moore on my staff, who really persevered through this long after I think commissioners were ready to throw in the towel. Ms. Hodelin owes 2 fine public servants a a debt of gratitude for all the effort they put in on her
Absolutely.
behalf. For me, well, let me clarify one of the facts. Did Ms. Hodolan get credit for her participation, for the experience that she had on the campaign?
She did.
She did. Okay. And it's part of DePauw's program that, excuse me, sorry, I'm a little bit hoarse. It's part of the program that in order to graduate, students have to participate in a couple of these experiential learning programs. Is that right?
That's correct. You have to complete 2 extended studies credits over the course of your 4 years.
I mean, we get into these debates, it happens from time to time, and it's always a little bit frustrating for me because somebody comes in and they try and construct a nice tight request that they think ought to, get the commission's support, and some commissioners have balked at providing an answer that is specific to the request that's in front of us, which is what the AO process was designed for. It says in the statute, people have a specific transaction that they want to ask the commission about, they can come in and get an advisory opinion. And yes, other people, but it's for the benefit of those requesters. And yes, other people who are in a situation that is materially indistinguishable, that's a pretty high standard, from that person can also rely on that advisory opinion. To me, it is significant that it's a university and that it's a 501c3, as Requesters Council pointed out last time. The fact that it's a 501c3 demonstrates that this organization cannot participate in any kind of political activity. And we say in Draft E that both the Extended Studies Program and the Grant Program are conducted in a nonpartisan manner and not for the purpose of advancing political goals. I think if we were to issue an opinion that was more broad in its language and said, as long as you've got an educational purpose, you can provide a stipend to someone for their political work, we would find all sorts of organizations out there, 501c4s and other groups, who would be happy to set up a program, and I'm sure they would consult with lawyers and put bells and whistles on it and say that this was all a good learning experience, but the bottom line would be that staff would be provided to campaign without the campaign having to pay for that staff. Some other person would be paying for it, probably someone that we'll never know about. It would be, it could turn into another way for dark money to be going into campaigns and subsidizing the work of campaign organizations. I didn't see much of a risk of that happening here. But if we were to issue a more broad-based answer, I do think that would be a risk, and that's why, you think Draft E looks like a lot. You have no idea how many drafts went back and forth before we got to Draft E. And I think that was my number one concern, that while I think that in this context, a student who's participating in a degree program in a university that has this kind of stipend program available for internships of all kinds. It's not limited to political internships, where we allowing Ms. Hodolan to get this stipend puts her on even footing with all of her student peers who are participating in other kinds of internships for non-political organizations. She's required to have some kind of an internship for a couple of them in order to graduate. It's as I said, a broad-based program that's not set up to put people in political internships. As you pointed out, the subsistence stipend doesn't depend on how many hours she worked or the entity with which she is placed as an intern or the economic value of the work that she's performing there. And I'm satisfied under all of those circumstances that it would be a pretty convoluted way for somebody to try and provide staff to political committees to try and fund a broad-based internship program like this at a university that is providing interns to all sorts of organizations. So I think that the opportunities for mischief are pretty slim in this situation. Are there other kinds of internship programs that might also be okay, even though they might be materially distinguishable from this. Sure, but those aren't in front of us now. You know, we have to deal with the situation that's in front of us, and when other situations come up, we can deal with those situations. If you're worried about, if you want to consider it on a more broad-based, in a more broad-based way, and we want to ask council to draft an NPRM, you know, to provide more broad-based guidance in a rulemaking context, we could do that. I'm not sure that would be the, that I think that ought to be our highest rulemaking priority right now. I can think of a few other things that I put in front of that, but, you know, I'm willing to consider that if what you're concerned about is issuing broad-based guidance. But that's not what we're here to do today. We're here to provide an answer to an individual requester. And I'm hopeful that, as I said, with a lot of effort from staff behind the scenes and with the guidance of our general counsel's office, and Mr. Wright, Mr. Moody, that I'm hopeful that we will finally get to a yes answer. But I'm here to answer this question and I'm not concerned about what other people are going to be doing, because if they are doing something that's different from this, they're going to have to come in and ask themselves, or, you know, they can, nobody's required to come in and ask for an advisory opinion, but it only applies to people who are the requester themselves or someone who is in a materially indistinguishable situation.
Commissioner Hunter.
The language actually says indistinguishable in all material aspects. So I think we owe it to the public to say what is material in our legal conclusion. And your answer was helpful, because now I have a better sense of what's material to you. It's material to you that it has to be university, has to be a 501c. They provide all kinds of different internships and some of the other stuff that you said. I don't necessarily agree that those should all be material, but I hear where you're coming from. I think what you're saying is that in order for it to be a bona fide program, that's the material part for this analysis. It's material to you. In order to be bona fide, those things have to happen. I just disagree that it has to be a university in order to be bona fide. And again, yes, it's a university that's asking the question, but we have to tell the public which part of it is material to our legal analysis. And I think I heard you say that the reason that it being a university is material to you, to speak to the bona fide nature of it, is because it's less likely that there's sort of dark money going through a university.
I think you and I just understand these words differently. It's not somebody out there who is in a situation that is indistinguishable in all material aspects from this can rely on this. That doesn't mean we're saying no to everybody else on the planet, but what is material, what is a material aspect of this is you're still looking at it in a rulemaking context. What's the broad-based rule that people can derive from this? There may not be a broad-based rule that people can derive from this. I'm not interested in issuing a broad-based rule in this context. I don't think that's what advisory opinions are for.
I think you're right that we just interpret this provision differently, and we probably have for a long time. I mean, thankfully, a lot of our AOs aren't terribly controversial, so we are able to spell out the legal standard. And then I went back and looked at a bunch of old ones, and that's pretty common, where I think we start, are you okay? You look like you're about to pass out.
Thank you. I'm fine. Thank you.
Where I think it starts to get dicey is, you know, this starts to look more like the Bob Kerrey AO, the one that we talked about in a different, seems like a year ago, but that was, I think, a few weeks ago, where that was just a one-off advisory opinion. And that one even went as far as to say, this is only for this guy at this situation at this time in history. And this, yes, this AO doesn't have that, but this really does, to me, seem like we're just answering the question for that one person, which I understand that's not a problem for you. I understand where you're coming from. I just disagree with that. And I think we owe it to the public to not say, you have to come in and get dragged into this place and, you know, pay a lawyer and come, what is this, the third time you've been here, come here multiple times to get an answer. People should be able to look at it and say, oh, I know what's material and what's not. And if there's a material part, if I'm trying to do a program and there's something that's, make sure I get the words right, indistinguishable in a material aspect, then I do have to come to the commission. But I'm still not really understanding why it's material in a legal sense that it's a university. I mean, one of the programs that I was thinking about is, I think it's called Close Up, or there's all kinds of different programs here in Washington where they bring interns in from all over the country. And I think we had an intern here from that program. And I don't know if they get credit or not. My understanding is they don't always get credit. And it's not through the university, it's through a nonprofit organization that's not a university. And so I would think that those programs are also for an educational benefit, but those kinds of programs, my understanding is they wouldn't be protected by this AO. And I know you asked the question about the credit. Is the credit a material aspect for you?
The fact that she's engaged in a university program and she is getting credit, and that it's a graduation requirement, all of that goes to demonstrate the educational value of this.
So it is material in this case.
I think the language on indistinguishable in all its material aspects, that is a factual, not a legal question. It's not for people to try and derive some broad legal principle from this. They have to look at whether their factual situation is indistinguishable in all its material aspects. Now, it could be that somebody else would be in a situation that was, in fact, distinguishable in some of its material aspects, and it might still be fine. But that's not the purpose of this advisory opinion, to give that kind of guidance to everybody in the world who might be setting up an educational program. That's for rulemaking. I'm happy to engage in that process if you want to, but that's not what we're doing today.
Right. I mean, again, we just disagree, because I don't think we should be saying, and maybe not quite saying this, that everybody should have to come in and ask the question if their stuff is different enough. And I do think that it is relevant to the legal principle here. And unfortunately, Draft E doesn't really have, it has a bit of a legal principle, but it is baked into this program. And that's part of the reason I'm having a hard time with it. And that's what we've been sort of going back and forth over since the last time you guys were here, because your original draft, Commissioner Weintraub, is similar to Draft E, because you've always said you do want to just answer the question for universities, and we were trying to pull you away from that, and I guess it wasn't all that successful.
Well, as I said, I think once you start stepping away from the universities, if we were to issue a broad-based ruling that says as long as you've got an educational purpose, you're home free, I think that we're going to see, if we were to issue that advisory opinion, Crossroads GPS, Priorities USA, all those groups out there would set up educational programs that, they would have a learning component, I'm sure, but I think most people would look at it and say, it looks like you're really just trying to supplement the staffing budget of the campaigns. And that is what I am not willing to do.
Sorry, Lee keeps humming in my ear, so it's a little distracting. Or is that humming, or what is that?
You want to entertain all of us? Got a good song over there?
The Frankie Valli song, So Close and Yet So Far Away, came to my mind last night when we were at an impasse, and I haven't been able to get it out of my mind.
Now he's singing it to me, and it's not helpful. I
don't know, I kind of thought it was helpful.
The draft that I circulated at some point, does have just a generic legal principle, and then applies the facts here to that statement. It says that the Commission finds that DePauw's status as an accredited nonprofit university creates a presumption that its internship program's purpose is educational and not political. So I agree with you that, the fact that it is education accredited nonprofit university it establishes bona fides more than just some fly-by-the-night group. And so we applied the legal analysis to it and said it's a presumption. We can change the word presumption, but the legal principle in the draft that I was trying to sell was educational subsistence stipends for the purpose of assisting students in fulfilling bona fide academic objectives and not for the purpose of providing personal services to campaigns are not, quote, compensation for personal services. Or I know you have an issue with that last part, but something along those lines where it's a general statement of the law and then it's applied to say, yes, universities, sort of probably more than anyone else, are a bona fide program. But it keeps the powder dry for people who want to argue or who want to rely on something and say at a later point that their situation is materially indistinguishable.
Other further comments, discussion? Vice Chairman Walther.
Let me ask you this. I gather you've had a chance to review this draft?
Mhm.
Okay. A couple of questions. What would stop taking this into consideration? And this does remind me of a law school play where this guy's getting arrested and he says, well, what about Escovedo? And the guy says, what's your name? And he says, Smith. And he says, we limit it to the facts. And so the guy went to jail. So here, I don't think we have to, I think we should look beyond that kind of a scenario and say, okay, what about the Smith brothers who might want to give $900 million to one particular campaign? And so they go to a number of universities who might be inclined to support a program like this and offer significant amounts of money for kids to participate. So it may not be partisan by the university, but the result is clearly a partisan one. Huge amounts of money spent. Say it's a super PAC. This isn't confined to this particular campaign. It's confined to anybody who wants to help in a campaign, regardless of whether you're a candidate or not. So the super PAC, I assume, could participate fully in this and fully fund universities, if they're universities or just educational institutions. I see there's not a clarity there exactly what we're talking about. But to fund that so that you have youth that are participating, and again, here it's like for 8 weeks for a contribution of $3,000, a little less than the minimum wage, throughout the country who are using that money for those kind of purposes. And I see in the one message that came through that if we deny this, that we would be hurting people who of color. But I think the point would be that some campaigns can't afford to do something like this, and some people can't. Some can. So that I'm not sure that if you're looking at the parity involved there, some campaigns have a lot of money, and some do not. So it may be that the campaigns that have the most money or the super PACs that have the most money have the most opportunity to have programs like this that allow kids to participate in programs designed just for those campaigns. There's no doubt here that those who are working for this particular program are going to work for one specific campaign. So you can say it's not conducted in a nonpartisan manner, but it certainly has that effect. So those are my concerns. Do you have any thoughts about how could that seepage of political money potentially come through the whole system, never to be reported necessarily?
I think under the...
How can we try and take a look at that issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think under the standards set forth in Draft D or Draft E, the program that you described, Commissioner, would not be permissible, and clearly would not be permissible. I mean, I think regardless of, which commissioners think whether particular facts are material to the ultimate determination that the program itself is for a bona fide educational purpose and not for a political purpose, there is broad agreement that has to be the applicable standard. And the program that you described is, sounds like an earmarked grant program that is specifically for a political purpose, that it may not specify the campaign that is the beneficiary, but if a donor goes to a university and says we want to provide X amount of money specifically to put kids on campaigns, we're not within this advisory opinion, because this program is absolutely not that. This is a program that clearly does not favor participation in campaigns versus participation in other opportunities with nonprofits and government.
So in this particular case, this particular campaign, Healer for America, could actually be, or the person participating could work for Bernie Sanders?
In this particular campaign, they could, if they had applied for, the fact that they had applied for Hillary Clinton versus Bernie Sanders versus the NRA versus working for local government.
I'm
is
sorry
immaterial.
about bringing up names because that really is not what we should be talking
No,
about.
but I guess my point is yes,
Point
it's
being-
not, but not only between candidates, but also between political committees and nonprofits, between political committees and government. And this is a pre-existing program that its rubric for deciding who gets these stipends, it does not take into account whether or not the person wants to participate in a political campaign versus take advantage of another opportunity. And I think that is actually the, if anything is material in this opinion, it is that particular standard and the set of facts around it. So
So does that mean that the student can, in this particular case, if we grant this, can work for any campaign?
they would have to apply and go through the process, but I'm confident after reviewing the program and after reviewing the rubric that the particular campaign for which they applied would have no impact on the decision that the university had made.
Well, that's the point, though. I mean, this isn't the foundation, the Global Election Foundation puts a lot of money into educational systems and say, hey, here's 10 programs. Let your students participate in whatever campaign they want to participate in for 8 weeks and come back with your report and you'll get credit for it. There's only one campaign that can apply in this particular case, right? Especially since we're limited to the facts.
I'm slightly confused as to whether you were asking whether or not someone could have worked for another campaign or whether a program that limits the grant money to campaigns generally is permissible. Because under this opinion, I do not think that a program that is specifically aimed towards working in campaigns in general would be permissible. That is, it is explicit here that this is limited to those who are a program that is broad pre-existing educational purposes, not for the purpose of putting people on campaigns themselves.
Yeah,
Commissioner
can
Russell.
I just follow up on that, though? That was suggested by Commissioner or Vice Chair Walther, that the Smith brothers are giving that money, but the school already has an established internship program. And so who's going to make the decision that it's a bona fide educational objective when the school says this is a bona fide objective, here, go ahead, have this internship money, and yet it actually comes from this group that is prescribing a certain outcome.
May I interject? By referring to Smith Brothers, were you alluding to any set of brothers in there?
I didn't allude to anybody. It was Mr. Vice Chair who was, it was Mr. Vice Chair who raised that issue, not me. I'm just trying to follow up on, what I see as the concern, because this answer to number 2 is that the stipends here are provided to students for bona fide educational objectives. And I don't know exactly how, while the school might indicate that, and so they might have an existing program, we don't know really whether it's actually in fact, and I don't think that it applies to your situation. We're looking at, how this is going to be read given the discussion that we've had today already. In the future, the fact that the school describes it that way, we're just going to, the FEC would just have to accept that, I presume, because they're characterizing their program that way.
No, I don't think the FEC would have to accept. I think here we presented in detail the methodology that was used and the rubric that was used to make these determinations. And if the rubric that was used is that you are more likely to get this if you work for a political campaign than not, then I think we'd have a different set of facts here. And if it was, if that was influenced by donor preference or for whatever reason, we'd have a different set of facts here. Here we have a rubric and a system that treats applicants who want to work for a political campaign no differently than applicants who want to work for a nonprofit or a governmental entity. And it is that parity in terms of how these decisions are made that I think more than anything here is the driving fact. And if that piece changed, then we wouldn't be living under this advisory opinion.
And I think that's the important point to bring up here is that, advisory opinions, we're under strict time deadlines. The process doesn't afford, a fact-finding component. We accept the facts as presented, and the degree of protection afforded by an advisory opinion is only, it only covers the situation that was represented accurately. If it turns out that a requester actually, the facts that they present to us are completely at odds with what the reality, then the protection of the advisory opinion is minimal at best in that situation. And I think that's something that we have to rely upon. And it's not the case that if you can somehow come in and mislead the commission into issuing an advisory opinion, that somehow, well, they snuck a fastball by us, and now they've got carte blanche to do whatever they want. That's not the case under our process. I mean, your representations, we take them as accurate, and so long as it's accurate, then that protection would apply. And if they aren't accurate, then there are no guarantees after that point. Are there further comments? I'll just first of all echo what Commissioner Weintraub said about the stellar work done by Tom Moore and Mike Colombo in terms of keeping this train on the tracks. And as drafts have been exchanged, as ideas have been discussed, as you've heard just in the time we've been discussing this advisory opinion, there's been concerns about answering the question too narrowly or answering the question too broadly. And the hope is that we have the Goldilocks draft right here, that we just we answer, we can thread the needle without having to go too broad or too narrow, so that the concerns that the commissioners that may hopefully form a majority on this can have their concerns addressed with respect to this particular request, but also allow for the possibility that we're going to have others who may have different scenarios that they would like to present before the commission. And I think that there was a concern that we not bind our hands one way or the other, foreclose possible other requests that come in, or give a total green light to others. So I think that there has been a delicate balancing act throughout this whole process. And I can support draft E, which has come in. Like any compromise draft, I think we all may be equally unsatisfied with certain aspects of what we would consider to be the ideal draft, but I think it gets us there. I think it's enough, and at the appropriate time, I'll be willing to support it. Is there any further discussion? Vice Chairman Walter.
Thanks. Again, what my concern is regardless of how it's phrased, I think it certainly is applicable to any super PAC or anybody else to be involved in exactly the same way this is involved. I'm concerned about the movement of money into the academic system in this way. I wouldn't be opposed to a rulemaking who really define this with more particularity, but I'm not comfortable with it. The Koenig opinion to me is clear law right now. It's been good since 1982. I don't think we should change it. And so I'm going to move at the appropriate time to approve draft A.
Commissioner Weintraub.
I just want to say, I respect my colleague's point of view, but like counsel, I do not think this opens the doors to super PACs setting up internships. Those aren't the facts that are in front of us. I think that would be plainly, materially distinguishable from the situation that we have in front of us. I just think that's an entirely different ball of wax. I wouldn't support it if I thought it said that.
Vice Chairman Walther.
Okay, one more word. I don't think it makes any difference in the way this would be applied, depending on who is the party that's trying to promote the program. In other words, there is this feeling that that would not be legitimate campaign work if it were somebody other than maybe a particular campaign. But good foundations, super PACs, or others who are involved will still be able to participate in a program like this, the way I understand it. And so as a result, I don't think we should embark on that without more clarity and more specific guidance, if that's where we're going to, move away from the, I think, fairly clear opinion that we already have.
Commissioner Weintraub.
And again, because I don't want this to be misconstrued in a way that neither the Vice Chairman nor I would support. I respect your concerns about that, but I do not think the scenario that you're describing is not the scenario that is in front of us. And I just want to be really, really clear that when I vote for draft E, it will be on the understanding that that scenario is materially distinguishable from the one that is described here and wouldn't be covered by this AO.
Commissioner Ravel.
I'd just like to concur with my esteemed Vice Chair on this matter, because I think there's too great a concern. It's quite clear that corporate contributions are not appropriate. And this would open the door to situations we don't know under any circumstance whether or not a valid internship is where it's funded and how it's funded. And so there's nothing in this draft that you're talking about that would preclude that, actually. And not that they would necessarily say specifically that it must be the only internship that goes for political activity. So I am too concerned about the potential ramifications of this, given the clear law that we have. And so I will support Vice Chair's motion.
Commissioner Weintraub.
I respect my colleague's position, but I am a little bit concerned that they are going to be encouraging people to read this broader than it is understood by the people who are voting for it, than it's understood by counsel. I mean, counsel is sitting there shaking his head. That would introduce new facts that are certainly not before us and are not part of what's going on here today. And in fact, I don't hear anybody at the table who is even contemplating voting for this suggesting that that would be okay. I've heard other kinds of scenarios raised, the Close-Up Foundation or other types of groups, but the notion of a super PAC funding the internships.
I didn't use the word super PAC.
It's or a corporation coming in and trying to funnel money for a particular ideological group or campaign. That's just not what we have in front of us.
Any further discussion? Commissioner Hunter.
I agree with Commissioner Weintraub. But it is kind of nice to hear it could be read more broadly. So
no, it can't. No, it can't.
So it might be helping me, but I'm just curious about this because I think corporations donate to universities all the time.
Yeah, correct. That's right.
And so does that mean that the president of a university can't endorse a candidate because maybe his university is, propped up by corporate contributions? And what about professors? Can they say, gee, I think, Hillary's a better candidate than Bernie for all of these reasons? I mean, I don't know where that takes you if we start really looking into who funds universities in this country. I'm just confused. Who knew? I guess some people don't believe in the First Amendment on college campuses, but that takes it to a whole new level. I don't know where that to me seems so far-fetched that I don't know where it leads.
Commissioner Goodman.
We aren't legislators and we aren't legislating here, but there are legislative presumptions, about what the bona fide educational purpose is. And let me just give some context. I went to the University of Virginia and I studied under Larry Sabato, who has tried to teach generations of young people that politics is a good thing and that you should engage and get involved. And he has students who come from Southwest Virginia, and I came from a poorer part of the state, the South Side Virginia. And he tries to place those people in governmental congressional offices, in campaigns, in the governor's office, and he pushes these young people out to go engage in the political process generally at nonprofit advocacy organizations. And sometimes he has to try to find them stipends of money to get them engaged. And it shouldn't be offensive to the law that for that overriding and manifest educational objective, a few of the kids, instead of going to work in the governor's office or congressional office, end up on a statewide campaign. And so that is not why I'm voting for this, but that informs my judgment of the purpose for which this money is being spent, and that it is not for the purpose of influencing these elections. And so on that, I hope we would entertain a motion. I want to give Commissioner Walther his opportunity to make a motion.
Is there any further discussion, or are we ready to go to motions? Commissioner Hunt? Oh. Okay. Commissioner Walther, would you like to?
I just move adoption of the draft A.
Is there any discussion on the motion? If none, all those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed, no?
No.
No.
Madam Secretary, the motion fails by a vote of 2-4 with Vice Chairman Walther and Commissioner Ravel voting aye, and Commissioners Weintraub, Goodman, Hunter, and myself voting no. Do we have another motion? Commissioner Weintraub.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move adoption of draft E as set forth in agenda document number 15-69E, and of course authorize council to make any technical and conforming edits.
Thank you. Are there, Commissioner Hunter?
I just went back through it, and I think that some of the things that might be material aspects to certain of us sort of in our heads aren't necessarily spelled out in the black and white on the piece of paper. And so, I mentioned this story to a few people. I was at the Iowa caucus a few weeks ago on vacation, and at my own expense, and ran into somebody who was an intern for one of the campaigns. And I'm not going to say which campaign, I don't know all the details, but I'm quite sure that, she was sent through a different program that, wanted her to experience elections. And she helped one of the candidates, and everybody in the airport, we were stuck in the airport for most of the day, thought that she had a pretty cool story. And she was really excited. I don't think she really cared all that much about who she was working for. It was more of an experience of seeing what it was like to knock on doors and get out the vote and all this kind of stuff. And I didn't ask her if she was getting academic credit, but I don't think she was. I'm pretty sure she wasn't. And so I've just been very interested in not foreclosing this, because I think it's a cleaner legally to state the principle and all the things I said before. But I don't think that the words on the paper, tie this to you have to have gotten credit, you have to go to a college, you have to go through a program with a college who requires you to take 2 independent extended studies things. I don't think that requires you here. I do think that this probably does, cabinet it a little bit more than I wanted to, but it does give some opportunity for other people to read this and have a program to involve students in our political process. So I will support it.
Commissioner Weintraub.
I just want to be really, really clear about this. If you, as I read this, it's part of the analysis. The program is administered for the sole purpose of assisting students with an educational experience, deposit an accredited institution of higher learning holding tax-exempt status under 26 U.S.C. 501c3. We're talking about students and what they need to graduate. If I do not read this as applying to anybody outside of the university context, that doesn't mean it's illegal outside of the university context. It just means it's distinguishable. That's not covered by this AO. Those people are no worse off tomorrow than they were yesterday. They're just wherever they are, and they're making whatever determinations they're making as to whether what they're doing is okay. But the fact that this is a university-based program is plainly stated is significant and material to me. If you think this says something else, this has been the problem all along, is whether we actually have a meeting of the minds. I I'm willing to support this because it has all those facts in here. And I want to be very clear that I do think they're material.
Okay. If we could take just a brief recess, we have a motion on the table, and we will vote on that motion. And so we'll take a brief recess. That's definitely an acceptable excuse. I know in your recovery phase, so not a problem at all. We are now back in session. We have a motion on the table, moving draft E. Is there any, Commissioner Hunter?
Thank you again for your time and your patience. I think without getting into all of it again, I'm just going to vote yes for the words on the paper.
Is there any further discussion? If none, all those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, no?
No.
Madam Secretary, the motion passes by a vote of 4-2 with Commissioners Weintraub, Goodman, Hunter, and myself in favor, and Commissioners Ravel and Vice Chairman Walther opposed. Thank you very much, Mr. Burkon and Ms. Lopez, for not only your patience here today, but also for the materials that you've provided, which have been very helpful in moving this process along. So thank you very much.
We appreciate all your consideration and hard work on this. Thank you.
All right. We will now turn to item number 4, which is the Audit Division Recommendation Memorandum on the Oklahoma Democratic Party, which is Audit 12-06. We will have a presentation from, is it Crucia or Crucia? What's the?
Crucia.
Crucia, okay. And Ms. Morcom. And we're also joined by Mr. Holloway. And so I don't know which one of you wants to take the lead, but whoever reaches for the microphone first, please proceed at your convenience.
Good morning, Commissioners. Before you is the Audit Division's recommendation memorandum for the Oklahoma Democratic Party. And it consists of 4 findings. The findings are misstatement of financial activity for receipts and disbursements, misstatements of financial activity for 11 funds, reporting of debts and obligations, and record keeping for employees. We're available for you to answer any questions.
All right, thank you for that presentation. Are there any questions or any comments? Commissioner Goodman.
Listen, we've discussed this. Just help me understand the draft final audit report of the Audit Division on the Oklahoma Democratic Party. So the DFAR itself was, I take it, provided to council or to the party of the Oklahoma Democratic Party, right?
Correct.
Okay. What is the significance and reason of stating at the bottom of page 1? So part 1, background, page 1, under commission guidance, the last sentence on the page. This audit report does not include any findings or recommendations with respect to Oklahoma Democratic Party employees paid with 100% federal funds and reported as such. What's the significance of that? What did that sentence mean?
It means that although the committee is required to maintain payroll laws for all employees, the commission has decided it would not pursue any where the committee paid the payroll with 100% federal funds and reported it as such. So if that was the case as of the date of the audit, then there would be no payroll finding.
Okay. So if I'm Mr. Reef and I received this, it would be fair for me to conclude, oh, the audit report is not going to recommend or make findings with respect to these people, to this payroll.
If that's the way the committee reported it before the audit notification letter.
Well, I mean, I'm just saying I was given a copy. I'm putting myself in the shoes of the Oklahoma Democratic Party, and I received a DFAR to give me notice of where the audit is headed. give me an opportunity to respond, give me an opportunity to request a hearing, all the rights that we grant these folks. And I'm told this audit report does not include any findings or recommendations with respect to employees paid with 100% of funds. Now, we've confirmed that they paid 100% federal funds.
Correct.
Okay, and it's a given that they didn't keep the logs.
Correct.
I understand that, okay. Then we receive a memorandum at the commission dated December 7, 2015, and on page 2 of the memorandum to the commission. So the DFAR went to Oklahoma Democratic Party.
Yes.
Then the memo is written to the commission, right? After that.
And after the committee has a chance to respond to it, yes.
And they didn't respond.
No, they did respond.
Okay, okay. Did they say, please don't make a finding as to payroll logs?
No.
Because they probably weren't alerted that it was going to be a finding.
Well, they did not request a hearing, and they also filed amended reports that materially corrected their 11 activity and moved the remainder of the $10,000 in payroll to Schedule B.
Right. And then a memo comes to the commission, and at the bottom of page 2 says, the audit staff recommends that the commission find that the Oklahoma Democratic Party failed to maintain monthly payroll logs totaling $201,551 to document the percentage of time each employee spent in connection with a federal election. Now, I'm not disputing, although there is some misunderstanding, I understand, because I wasn't here, but about what the commission meant by pursue, and whether it just meant enforce or whether it meant make the finding as well. But let's just focus on the mixed signals that the commission has sent to the Oklahoma Democratic Party on page 1 of the DFAR they received, and then the memorandum that postdates it to the commission that does recommend a finding with that respect. It just seems like it was a bit unfair to them. I don't know what response they would have made, whether they would have come and asked, please don't make a finding as to that. I assume that counsel is sophisticated. Mr. Reef is their counsel, am I right about that? He's sophisticated. He understands there's probably not to be any further pursuit based on such a finding, because all the money was paid 100% from federal. We've verified that. Right. I just note that it looks a little unfair to send someone a signal that there is to be no recommendation or finding, and then to recommend to the commission that we make the finding. And I can see how that could have, in the volume of audits and the reports, these two little sentences contradict each other. And I guess I just commend to the commission consideration that we did not tell the Oklahoma Democratic Party that we were getting ready to make that that the audit staff would make the recommendation or the commission would make the finding. So it just seemed like it was a bit unfair as I read it. I thought I would feel a little bit sandbagged by that. Yes, ma'am.
Well, the language that's coming from in the audit report on page 1 in the commission guidance, that's the same language that's in every audit report that contains a payroll finding. Is also information that we do discuss with the committee, usually starting at the entrance, throughout field work, we also present it at the ETSA conference. So we always make them aware of the regulations as in this commission guidance, the language that as it pertains to payroll finding, whether or not it was paid 100% federal funds and reported as such. So they've always been aware of that. And like I said, it's in every version of the report. And this report is consistent with past audit reports with similar situation where the committee at the time of the audit reported payroll on H4, and then after the audit, removed the payroll to Schedule B. And the ADRM will have the same recommendation.
Well, let me read on, because later in the DFAR, under finding for record keeping for employees, it tells this narrative history of the amendments.
Correct.
But it draws no conclusion when you reach the end of it on page 14. It talks about how all the funds were verified, that they were paid 100% with federal funds. It gives the committee credit for implementing new procedures to keep logs. It says they complied with the interim audit report, but it doesn't make a final finding that, by the way, after all you've been through and after all the reports you've amended, and after all the verification we've done, there's nonetheless going to be a finding that you failed to keep the logs. I mean, it's not clear in the finding so I'm just saying, as a lay reader, if I read this, I would say, yeah, that's all, pages 12 to 14 is all accurate. That all happened. That's a nice narrative. That's the story of our audit. That's the story of the amendments we filed. But I rely on page 1 that says there's to be no finding on that. And then and then you write a memo to the commission that says, oh, make a finding for failure to keep the logs. Now, we may have done this way a dozen of times or maybe 24 times. But this one's the one that caught my eye, and we ought to fix it here somehow. So I'm just looking to fix this somehow. And since I saw it and we know it and we're speaking about it publicly, my recommendation would be, let's just take, in this instance, let's take finding 4 out. And then maybe we can write these clearer for people in the future to make quite clear that there is going to be a recommended finding for failure to keep the logs, notwithstanding the fact that the commission has by policy decided not to pursue them thereafter.
I guess my only concern with that is we do
Zora.
clearly articulate, my apologies.
Oh, not a problem.
We do clearly articulate on page 13 what the legal standard is. And in the past, with some of the other committees where they've been impacted and it actually was highlighted as a finding, now we're going to differ for the same cycle. And I guess that to me is concerning.
Oh, sorry about that. Commissioner Weintraub.
Thank you. I appreciate the point that my colleague is making, and I know that you weren't here when we started going down this road, but this is a path that we decided to pursue. It's sort of a compromise path that recognizes that there's nothing in the regulation that exempts a committee like this from keeping these logs. I mean, we can't say that they did it right exactly. It's just that it's sort of a no harm, no foul kind of situation where they decide they don't want to keep the logs and they're just going to pay for everything out of federal funds and report it that way. We're not going to ding them further on that. And this is the path that we have pursued, and I don't know how many audits, and I'm quite sure that some of those audits involve the same counsel. In fact, maybe the first one that we started down this road on involved the same counsel. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I don't think I'm fairly confident that he would not be sandbagged by this, and his client would not be sandbagged because he knows this is the way we handle these. And I share Ms. Orrock's concern about our suddenly deviating from a path where we're making findings within the same cycle, one way for one committee and one way for another committee.
If I can just follow up on that, did we make findings? And it's been a few years, so I just can't recall the audits that have arisen out of that particular audit cycle. After we voted back in 2012 to say that we were no longer going to enforce the failure to maintain logs for employees that are paid with 100% federal funds, were there subsequent audits where we still made the finding and those just weren't referred, or were the audits that arose out of the same cycle prior to that vote? I just can't remember off the top of my head.
And any subsequent audits after the decision was made, we never looked for the record keeping for the 100% federal employees. In these situations, what is happening is they didn't initially report them that way.
Mm-hmm.
So when we went out there, we had a finding, and in response to that finding at the interim stage, the committees have come back and moved the reporting to 100% federal on Schedule B. And so that's where the rub is, really. This action is taking place after the interim audit report.
Can I?
Oh, yes, Commissioner Goodman.
Did I hear you correctly that had they reported this as 100% federal from inception?
Correct.
When auditors walked in the door, they wouldn't even look for the logs? They wouldn't?
That's right.
Okay. Well, then hold on. So this is a little different than some of the others, it strikes me. Here, they may have misreported early. It got us looking. It got the log problem into the audit report, but it turned out that it was paid all federal anyway. And so what changed is the reporting of it, but the reality of where the funds came from. And so why do we need to make the finding to treat them equally, to treat them like other people who paid 100% federal? Their problem was that they misreported it to begin with as allocated.
Well, that's,
Commissioner Weintraub.
if I might, sorry. That's sort of what we do. When people get it wrong in the first instance and then fix it in the course of the audit, we note that in the audit report, and we do make findings about people who did it wrong originally. They fixed it. Obviously, that would be a mitigating factor if we were going to do anything else. But I think we're being consistent here with how we treat other committees that start out misreporting, and then by the end of the audit, they've unwound it and
Well,
reported it
but
the
Commissioner
right way.
Weintraub, here they didn't fix the underlying problem of where the money came from. They always paid 100% federal money. There was never a time where they subsidized their federal payroll with state money.
Did they? Because I heard them say, I heard the auditor say that they moved the money.
No, the money was always 100% federal. It was the way it was
They
reported.
misreported as allocated, and they said, oops, we should have reported this as 100% federal. That's what got our auditors looking at it and steered down this road to begin with. Now, they then amended their report to report it accurately. Maybe there's a finding of a reporting problem here. But had they reported the true facts initially accurately, we would have never even looked for the logs because it was paid under the policy that the commission adopted. We would have never even looked for the logs. We wouldn't have even made an audit finding.
But this is a reporting finding.
Well, this is a log finding.
Record keeping.
That's the way we've treated it. Typically, when something is presented at the interim report, we don't change the title of the finding. We just draw it out with an explanation as to what happened. And so it's no different than a misstatement here. We did the same thing. If the committee, we go out there and the committees are misstated, we put in a recommendation in for them to correct their reports. They do, and that's how we. But it stays in the audit report. We don't take the finding out. So it's no different here with a record keeping situation.
One way to resolve this is when they write what's the next final audit report? What's the next?
Proposed final audit report would be next.
When they write that, we could approve this with an instruction to remove this finding from that report, to remove a finding on failure to keep logs, because all's well that ends well. Because in fact, there never really was a problem under commission policy.
Vice Chairman Walter.
I mean, I have a little reluctance when you have a report and then you start removing stuff, but I'm pointing in the final, if it could just be a footnote pointing out what happened and just go on with it.
So I think typically it's at the stage where it's at the proposed final audit report where the commission then, if there's not enough votes for it, that it goes to other issues.
It could go to other issues. We noted this because of the initial report. We later found that it was a reporting issue, not a payment problem. And therefore we moved it to other issues. And in other words, we could approve this whole audit report and then with instructions that in the proposed final audit report, that this log issue be moved to other issues along with the narrative, by the way, of how it came about. That's fine with me.
Right, and I would almost seek guidance from OGC. My understanding is if you approved at this point, we would still go forward with our proposed final audit report as audit sees fit, which is current, and then if the votes weren't there, then it automatically goes to other issues, if there weren't 4 votes for it. Lorenzo, is that correct? Yes.
Would you take a strong suggestion about what you should see as fit?
So, and again, my one concern with this that I always try to is the consistency factor. Okay. With the language that we used, it's the same because we draw it from each and every report.
Okay. Let me ask you this. What if we were to split 3-3 on this one finding now at this stage? Would it then automatically go to other issues in the proposed final audit report? Yes.
I believe so, but I would highlight to my peer. Ask.
Mr. Kell, I see that we're having, is there anything that we should, that would help us out in our consideration of the, yeah, what light can you shed on this issue for us in terms of?
Yes. It should be now.
Okay.
Yeah.
The time is now?
Yes.
I don't know that we have to split over this. I hope I've convinced somebody that there's no there. And we would be treating them the same as other people who spend 100% 100% federal funds. So I don't know that it has to be a split.
Ms. Borkham, I noticed you seeking recognition.
Yes, thank you, Chairman Peterson. I also wanted to point out that we did have a case, an audit from the 2010 cycle, where the committee did originally report payroll as allocable in Schedule H4. Then once the audit commenced, they moved it all to Schedule B, but that remained a finding in the audit report. The commission approved that the committee failed to maintain the payroll logs for the original payroll that was on H4.
Was this issue discussed this way?
Well, and was the approval before the November 28th, 2012 vote that we took as a commission? Do we know when that was approved? Oh, Ms. Orrick.
It was, the final audit report was approved on March 18th, 2014.
Okay, so after, okay.
I mean, it may not have been noted as a problem, and now we see it. We should catch it when we see it, would be my point.
Well, and yeah, I mean, the question is going forward, how are we going to, I mean, I can see both. I completely agree with my colleague Commissioner Goodman that there's no harm here, and so it seems that there should be some recognition in the PFAR regarding that fact, because when you read this as it is, it looks like there's a record keeping violation, but I also understand the concerns about consistency, and so I'm wondering. Not only consistency, but that there was I mean, this really is less of a failure to keep logs, and it was more of an initial failure to accurately report the funding for these employees. Trying to figure out what's the best way to skin this cat.
Well, I think two things. I mean, there could be clarification in the PFAR going forward with the language on the commission guidance page to probably more clearly reflect where the situation is and pair it up with what's actually in the finding of the report as well. Going 3-3, that's kind of your all's decision.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the audit program goes, I think there was clarification on the most recent audit program that was approved, where I think the subject was brought up and it was addressed there.
So this really will be the last time that, I mean, or you don't think?
No, yes.
You don't think the changes to the audit book?
No, I think
or are there other audits out of the same cycle that we're going to have?
Addressed the same way. I mean, if we go out there in an audit and there's no records there for these employees that are on H4, it's still going to show up. And if the committee amends in response to the audit, it'll still be there, the same way. I think moving forward, we probably could, like I said, we could massage that language a little bit better to pair up between the audit, the commission guidance section on page 14 and the finding itself.
I mean, I have the same concern that Commissioner Goodman has, that, what purpose does a finding have in that? I mean, it's, we do, let me just finish my thought. Well, I'll forget it if I don't continue on, but then I'll recognize you. While it's true that the reg does require these, that these logs be maintained, it's not a statutory requirement. It's a requirement to assist the commission in being able to identify whether or not employees were, whether or not they had the right split between potential, to ensure that there was no subsidization of non-federal monies being used for employees who should have been paid with just federal funds, or whether they there was an over-subsidization of non-federal funds for these employees. And when 100% of the money that paid these individuals, it comes from federal funds, there's just no concern over the statutory requirement that gave rise to this regulatory requirement. And so what in that particular instance, what's the purpose of having a finding just for finding's sake?
Well, remember when we first get out there that there weren't any records, and when we compared it to how the employees were reported, we looked for the record and there was nothing there. It's only after the audit that the committee has taken action, which kind of changes the narrative.
Okay.
Maybe-
We'll turn, Mr. Holloway.
No, go ahead, 'cause
Yeah.
there's-
No, I was just going to make the
informational
point
than
that,
mine.
I think the real rub here, as Tom's describing it, is that normally when the auditors go out, they're trying to determine if the records are actually there. And if the records are not there, then of course, yes, that's a finding for record keeping. What makes this case a little bit different, I think the issue is being raised as to whether or not they actually had to keep the records, because what we're saying is that they were paid with 100% federal. They were, in fact, paid. And so maybe the argument is that they never actually had to keep the records for that because they were paid with 100% federal. So I think that's what the real issue. So what you're looking at, this is not the normal record keeping finding, because the issue is being raised whether or not they actually ever had to keep the records because they were playing. And so what the committee is actually doing, basically, I think what we're challenged with is whether or not the committee could change their mind and say, oh, we just reported it incorrectly. We're just going to recall this everything 100% federal.
Okay.
So I think that's what the real rub is.
Okay. Commissioner, Vice Chairman Walther.
It just seemed to me, we kind of created this situation when we decided that we would essentially waive or overlook the reporting when there's in the representation or finding that it was 100% federal. So that's what we do now. But if somebody, it seemed, my concern is that when you get on the field, you might find yourself a whole slew of things that ultimately could be corrected, but you have to, as a matter of fashion, note everything that you find not to be correct. And they sometimes get corrected, sometimes they don't. But I don't think it's good for our process to then go back and delete them or erase them or that kind of thing. But to the extent they can be clarified later, then no harm, no foul. And I think the public or their counsel will certainly understand that. Certainly in this case, everybody knows now that we overlook records if it's 100% federal. That's what we do. So I'm concerned about trying to take this one incident and then developing a process that wouldn't be very workable when you get out in the field and find a whole slug of things that I'm sure you find some pretty messy stuff, and then it comes back and then you have to start erasing things. I don't think that would be a good idea. So I don't know in this particular case if that's what we're talking about. I guess my thought was you'd put a footnote in the final thing, or I guess we could move it to issues, but it seems to be kind of clumsy to move it to issues when it's just a matter of how we're trying to, I wouldn't call it clean up, how to try and emphasize the fact that that was just something that was overlooked early on. And when you left the field, what did you know?
No, we didn't know until the response to the
till later.
To the interim.
Yeah.
Commissioner Weintraub.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Commissioner Walther. I think this is consistent, what staff is proposing is consistent with the way they normally handle something that gets fixed in the course of the audit. Now, yeah, I'd open as to whether maybe you want to change the title of the finding to reporting, make it a reporting finding rather than a record-keeping finding. Do you think that would be more accurate?
At legal sites, I would imagine too, if that were the instance.
Reporting of payroll? I don't know. But I mean, it does seem to me that they did have a mistake and they fixed it, which is good. And we're happy that they fixed it. But, it was there to begin with, and that's the way we usually handle things that are mistakes when we start the audit.
Could I?
Yes,
Mr.
Commissioner
Chair.
Ravel.
Could I ask about, there is some remaining money. It's not as much, obviously, as what we've been talking about previously, but there is this amount of $10,511 in salaries that the reports didn't disclose. So I'm not sure whether that even a title would really be appropriate. I believe
they can
start. Yes.
There's no longer any amount remaining. At the time of the response to the interim audit report, it was 10,000. When the committee responded to the DFAR, they moved to 10,000 to Schedule B.
Okay.
So
it's
there's
all
no
been
longer,
moved. Okay.
correct.
Okay.
What is the pleasure of the commission?
I'd like to
Commissioner
move to
Goodman.
other issues at this point in time. So Mr. Chair, I don't want to supersede the vice chair's role of making a motion, but if he wants to move it, I would probably then move to amend it to move section 4 into other issues at this stage.
Well, it would be, I think, another proposal would be to have a motion as to findings 1, 2, and 3, and then have a separate motion as to
Finding 4.
Finding 4. We could do that. So, Vice Chairman Walter, if you wanted to make those two motions.
Any further comment on that? What does that mean for us in the future, though? Let's talk about that.
I'm not sure if
find
it has
ourselves
any, I
doing
think that
things
this,
once in a while, like we vote for 125%, and then we always vote 100, and then we go through the process. Is that what we're going to do in the future now? Does everything go to issues when there's a
We do this
record-keeping
often
mistake early on?
I think
I don't remember
there's not
doing
really a
that
precedent being set, other than that whenever there's a split on a particular finding, it just goes to additional issues. I don't think it necessarily modifies your procedures going forward. It's just,
Yeah, so
it's
it-
unique to this audit. We may want to talk in the future about, is there a better way of handling these sorts of situations? Or a different way, or maybe this is the way that is the best way for the auditors to handle it. But I think if there's a split on that particular finding,
You're
I think
comfortable
it's,
with it, then I guess I'm a little more relaxed about it. It just seems like that, have to go through that whole extra step. It's kind of a pain. I don't know. Suppose there's 3 or 4 different things, and then are we all going to go to additional issues for everything that gets corrected, or with a tiny mistake or something like that? Because additional issues makes it look like there's something indecisive that came out of it because there's a deadlock. And so I'm just wondering if there's a cleaner way to do it. But I mean, if you guys are okay with it, then fine.
oh yes, sorry about that, Ms. Orrock.
I wouldn't say we're okay with it. We certainly will do what the commission would like. You're going to continue to see it in the same fashion for quite some time. In the future, the commission can make a determination about what we do as far as thresholds and whatnot. But again, that's a decision of the commission. We're just merely following what was outlined in the past.
Question for
Commissioner
Ms.
Goodman.
Orrock. But Ms. Orrock, does that mean that the DFARs are going to continue to tell people that there is no recommendation or finding?
We can,
That's the issue?
we can attempt to par that up a bit better. The reason that that's there is that's straight from the vote certification that was taken at that time, and we've had it there since the 2010 cycle audits. So that's merely our fact of trying to move audits forward and try to get them approved. And so we use the same similar language that we've used in the past.
Whether it's accurate or not?
It's what's stated on the vote certification. We can try to make that more clear.
Okay.
Because should we, just follow up on your questions, Commissioner Goodman, that it may be better or maybe more accurate to say that no enforcement actions will arise out of
Yeah, I think
out of employees being paid with 100% federal funds. I wonder, yeah, if
in
it's
similar situations, if the same fact pattern happened again in the DFAR, we probably should be changing that language, and especially in the commission guidance section, to more mirror what we actually have in the written in the finding.
I just want to make sure you don't feel like you're bound by the vote certificate. I can fully understand why you would use that, because that's something that's actually,
It's a tangible.
it's a tangible document. You don't have to guess. You've got something. And I'm wondering if there would be any objection from the commission about modifying that, just to make, because I think that's a clearer, it would be more accurate to say that it's not, because I think when you say findings, we're talking about audit findings, and in this case, I think it could be a little bit misleading, but could be confusing. And so to tighten that up a little bit to fully convey what that means, I think would probably be useful going forward, just so as to
We can actually go back and
ensure
listen to
that
the
there isn't
full audio
confusion.
as well.
Okay. Okay.
So-
Vice Chairman Walther.
For the motion, do we want to say that it goes to additional issues in this case?
I think what we can do is just,
Wanna
you
do-
could do findings 1, 2, and
1, 2,
3. And I believe those will have 6 votes, and then make a motion as to 4. And if it doesn't get the required votes, then it automatically goes to additional
Okay, so we
issues.
want to go to additional issues. I mean, we will go to additional issues as opposed to some corrective way to do it, which is fine.
So, and we can keep, this
Can we
discussion
decide on
alive
that for the
about
next
how
go
to,
around?
maybe there's, some better ways to handle this going
Yeah.
forward, but
Okay.
we can keep that discussion
Okay,
alive.
well, I move approval of findings 1, 2, and 3 of the recommendation, and that's, vote.
Is there any discussion on the motion? If none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Madam Secretary, the motion passes by a vote of 6-0.
Now I'll move approval of finding 4.
All right. Any discussion on the motion? If none, all those in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 Those opposed?
No.
No. The motion fails by a vote of 3-3, which means that finding 4 will be in the additional issues of the proposed final audit report. All right. Thank you very much for your presentation and for that discussion. And like I said, we got to probably keep this discussion alive just to figure out how to make sure that we can have this as clear as possible going forward. That is the end of our substantive agenda, Mr. Staff Director. Do we have any management or administrative matters?
Mr. Chairman, there are no such matters.
This meeting is adjourned.